the AHPA Good Agriculture and Collection Practice, Good Manufacturing Practice guidance for herbal ingredients, and an overview of how we're working together to implement this guidance document. And this session is sponsored by Indina, which again we greatly appreciate. And I know that what the discussion is going to be now that we created this 101-page document, how do we make it relevant on little bitty farms and big extract manufacturing facilities and every place in the ingredient supply chain from seed right to the point of receipt by supplement manufacturers. So that's what the next speakers will discuss, and I'll turn it over to Guillaume Blin from NatureX to introduce the speakers. Thanks, Guillaume.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. So thank you for staying with us for that last session of the day. So first, I would like to say that NatureX is a proud sponsor of that Botanical Congress since 4 years now. And we thank the Michael McGuffin and the AHPA staff for that. So this session is about an overview of the AHPA GACP-GMP guidance and its implementation via its tool assessment. So this guidance has been released this year in March 2017, and the tools that are associated with it have been released a few weeks ago in August 2017. So after having already drafted the first version of GACP back in 2006, so Ed, you were already part of it, AHPA was in the best position to create a comprehensive guidance that connects the best practices with regulatory framework from the field to the finished herbal ingredient. So as quality starts in the field and consumer demand more and more quality and transparency, this guidance and this assessments tool help the industry to conduct pragmatic evaluation to identify and address their gap and therefore raise their standards. So our first speaker, Ed Fletcher from Herbal Ingenuity, will give us a detailed presentation of the guidance and the tool. And secondly, April Duffy from Amway will present some concrete example of GACP implementation. So those practices are also well established at NatureX, where we use GACP as part of our supplier qualification program and apply strictly GMP in our extraction facility. NatureX has also a strong botanical identification program in which we use a battery of analytical tests to identify our raw material. So let's get started with Ed. So I'm going to present you, Ed. Everybody knows you, but so Ed Fletcher is the Director of Quality and Sustainability at Herbal Ingenuity. He has been in the botanical business and made his livelihood with plants of all of his adult life. He is a current board member of AHPA, serving his 4th term, and is chairing the Botanical Raw Material Committee. He also serves on the USP Convention Botanical Dietary Supplement and Herbal Medicine Expert Committee. So, Ed, please.
Thank you, Guillaume. And again, thank you for hanging out in here and not going to the DNA, even though it's interesting. We'll try to make this interesting also. So I'm going to try to give you some read between the line stories and some examples of how this is applicable in the real world, out in the real world. But just a curiosity, how many of you somewhere, if not yourself specifically, but within your company, consider GACP as one of the qualifying factors from your suppliers? Yeah, you look good. I'm glad to hear that. We all should in some form or fashion, at least on the purchasing side, because as Guillaume said, that's one of the things you need to ask. If you ask some of your suppliers, what do they follow before you go in and do an audit? If they don't have some sort of standard or GACP on the raw material side that they follow, then it's going to be a long day inspecting and training them. So anyway, so as Guillaume said, the original GACP, we released it in 2006. And in 2015-16, we had the interest from quality throughout the supply chain. In 17, just recently, we had some of the updates and the assessment program, which is the last thing on the list. We're going to go over that at the very end. To me, that's the greatest thing that has come out since 2006. because it tells you, the buyer or even the auditor, how to audit and some of the questions you should ask your supplier. So just to go over some of the specifics, the details, in Section 1 we talk about the definitions, 2, botanical ID and quality, which do go hand in hand. And then 3 through 7 of this document sections go through the GACPs from the field to the forest to the post-harvesting, the post-harvest handling. And fortunately, I'm going to give you more of the verbiage, and then April is going to get to show you a lot of the fun part and the photos from Trout Lake Farm on how they implement these things. And then Section 8 goes through the processing. Section 9 goes through the basic food facility GMPs, because if you don't start out with the farm and the field with the good GACPs, it's very difficult to meet the GMPs once you get in-house. So, and also some of the recommendations in the appendices we're going to talk about a little bit with supportive information and some of the formats and the forms that we use to, again, to audit your suppliers. So why is it needed? Especially, this should be an easy answer. In today's industry, with FSMA coming into effect, it's obviously needed for many reasons. It does automatically help with transparency, and in my opinion, if it's followed, it automatically addresses many of the quality issues, many of them. Obviously, we've talked about in the previous session, David pointed that out, the challenges in the managing a global supply chain, from the fact that 1,000-pound lot may be supplied by 20 different suppliers of a wild-crafted item or even a cultivated item. So just to know the transparency and the history of that is very empowering to your next supplier. The regulations, we know the regulations are changing here in the U.S. with FSMA coming into effect, and also the lack of comprehensive GACP and current U.S. food regulations, because they can refer you to the AHPA GACPs or perhaps the EMA or the EU. There's a lot of GACPs. WHO has theirs. But in other words, I wouldn't pick one over the other, but whatever applies best to you is just a fact that you're following some form or fashion of GACP. The general guiding principle is not one size fits all. We know that. We've talked about that already today. These products do not come from one set of farming techniques or one location. They come from a variety of locations, a variety of different farming or wildcrafting techniques. So you've got to determine what elements of this, each GACP and also the assessment tool, apply to you, and use these elements that best apply. And they're also scalable, which is very important, because we come from very small farming, small scale wildcrafting practices too. Botanical ID. Yeah, who in the last year has seen so many things about botanical ID? I've known this all of my life working with species. It has to be the right genus, the right species. If it says so on the bottle, it better be that. And unfortunately, from what the New York Attorney General did a couple years ago, it's really brought this to the forefront, that we have to address this. And to me, it's very simple. If you want to see it, come to the field, come to the forest. I'll show it to you. I'll show you the taxonomic ID, why it's this genus, why it's this species. But when it goes a little further up the supply chain into a cut and sift, a powder and extract, that's when you run into problems. But again, that's where you have to have your continuity, your transparency through the supply chain, so you can follow it from the beginning raw material to the end product. And always written specifications. This is no fun. Whenever I tell a farmer, hey, you've got to record, what was the temperature that day? When did you harvest it? What time of day did you harvest it? When did you get it in the dryer? Did you wait for 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours? What temperature did you put it in? Write it down. Put it down. That's one of the hardest things for them to do. They're too busy doing this. But you've got to get them or somebody beside them to stop and sit down and write these things down. You've got to have written specifications and have them written down to follow. And the sampling, we all know how important sampling is. It does no one any good whenever you have a 10,000-pound lot and you don't do proper batch analysis sampling, proper protocol through USP or some established protocol for sampling. If you just pull out of one bag and send it in, oh yeah, it passes, and then when you get your shipment there, it's going to be rejected because you really don't have a true representative sample. So that's very important. Talk a little bit more about ID. Again, identity, I showed a slide yesterday. I don't have it today, but you've really got to stick with the Latin binomial name. My slide showed where if you typed in toxidendron, it will come up and show you poison ivy. If you typed in poison ivy, it could show you a multitude of things, people dressed up like poison ivy. So anyway, you've got to be very careful with that. The physical characteristics are also very important, which this addresses in the GACPs, the moisture, what moisture level you want, the particle size, the foreign material, and there are tolerances, generally speaking, for a foreign material. But remember, if you're buying Echinacea purpurea herb, and you leave a little too much, you dig down or cut it a little bit too low to the ground and you get some root in there, that root part of the sticking onto the herb is considered a foreign material. And if it's too much, it can be adulterated. So it's just the right, even within the plant part, besides all the rocks and the, believe it or not, I mean rocks, the belt buckles, the shotgun shells, the metal knives, all kinds of things we have in our collection of things specifically more so from wildcrafted. But then in cultivated, you'll have a bolt from a tractor, things that come in. When it's coming in straight out of the field, remember folks, it's still a farm raw agricultural product. So you've got to treat it as such and clean it. And then when you get up to the chemical characteristics, the extractives, the marker content, the oil content, all of that is very important. And again, not only testing, but documentation to carry through. Contaminants, again, I spoke about adulterated plant parts. Specifically here, we're talking about adulterating species. Spoke yesterday of Hypericum, St. John's wort. There's over 369 different species of Hypericum in the world. And if I'm not mistaken, close to 27, maybe 32, somewhere in that range, grow in the areas, generally speaking, where the proper Hypericum perforatum grows. So you've got to be careful. It can be easily mixed in if you're not really diligent from that side. The heavy metals are an issue that I'm afraid we're going to have to deal with in many different ways. We see crops that we've grown in the same field for many years in that same field not have an issue with heavy metals. And then we grow another crop in that field, heavy metals pop up because that particular species or root type may pull some of the metals out of the crop, or maybe it holds on to them more. But as a general rule of thumb, historically, heavy metals are associated and are held in the dirt. And if you have a crop that's got a really rough root system, if you're looking at the root of it, sometimes you just need to not exfoliate, but get as much of the cutting and shaking off as much of the dirt off of the product as you can, because the heavy metal can tend to be contained in the ash or the soil that's in that crop. And then the microbials they've been an issue, they always are. Most of us who dry materials now understand what we need to do, the proper temperatures that are set up in most monographs for some of the heavily or the more heavily traded crops. But you have to get your microbes down, and the way to get that initially is in your proper drying techniques. Don't harvest today, leave it sitting in your tractor in your pile until tomorrow, and then decide to put it in your dryer. The shortest time, number one, that we get a crop from harvest into the drying to stabilize the degradation of the product, that's a good start on your microbes. And then the levels that you heat it at or heat treatment, whatever you do, you just got to document that and keep up with it. Pesticides, oh boy. Pesticides, we've had a lot of issues on pesticides because of the specificity of the testing nowadays. You have to watch for that more. I'm on a panel with the USP about we're trying to get the EPA to help us with. Right now they have, if you don't have a product listed, a pesticide listed for your crop, it's zero tolerance. And we know that's impractical. I mean, the EU has minimum residual limits. Canada has minimum residual limits. Australia does. All we're asking the EPA is to set some MRLs for some of these non-point pesticides. Non-point means a pesticide that just shows up over here even though you're hundreds of miles away, or even on a wildcrafted product. You know, you think out in the woods in the middle of nowhere, you're not going to get pesticides. Well, it's been proven that there are pesticide residuals in the ice caps in Greenland, which is really scary. I mean, if we tested this carpet here, we could probably find pesticide residuals in some form or fashion. So right now, with many of the rejections and the issues we're having, we're saying that just being in a real world, in today's real world, we have to have some MRLs established for these pesticides. The zero tolerance when you're testing parts per billion is just not feasible. On the cultivation side, April's going to speak about this a little more, but just a couple things. The propagation material, you got to make sure you're starting out right. The cultivation site needs to be clean to start off with. You have to have the right water. We talked about water quality early. And the site and the history of use. We tested a crop that showed up, this was grown in Canada, had DDT and its residuals. We traced the field back 14 to 17 years. There had been nothing applied on that field for 17 years. And yet, if you read the label from the manufacturer of that particular pesticide, the half-life, which is the life it's going to live out in the soil, was like 4 years. So that doesn't work. And you can't go back to Monsanto and complain about that. You know, it's too far gone. They've already taken it off the market. It's been outlawed for many years, but it's still showing up in the soil. So that history of the field is very important. Fertilizer use, you just got to be careful with that. And irrigation sources, April will talk about that too, but you've got to make sure that it's potable, it's legal, it's clean irrigation sources, and even washing sources after you harvest your material. You just can't use surface ponds now. You don't know what's in them. So, again, cultivation, just crop maintenance. She's going to show some really good slides on that and talk about that. And some of the other considerations, GMO, organic, environmental stewardship. These are all things we have to consider, and they are addressed in the GACPs. Wild collection. I'm going to focus a little bit more on wild collection since April is going to be talking about cultivation. But again, as I spoke in the last session, we've even had wildcrafters out in the woods, and they say, I want to make sure I'm getting the right species, and they may send me a photo on their cell phone, off their cell phone, to see if they're right species, just to make sure. But train your wildcrafters. We qualify, if they're going to bring us a Chamaelarium luteum, we qualify them before they ever go out and harvest that. We tell them when to harvest it, what to do with the seeds, how to replant, when to not disturb the environment, and the permits and permissions. I mean, if you're going on public or private land, you need to have permission to go on this land. You just can't assume that it's okay to harvest this crop off of land. And there are federal lands that they do allow collection permits going through the proper channels. And again, the collection sites, you know, are you downstream from a nuclear facility? Are you downstream from some manufacturing? You have to consider that and be careful. The site characteristics, is it a moisture-laden crop? For example, if you harvest a crop that's in a bog-type situation, some of the Sarracenias they use, you know the high moisture is going to be, the moisture is going to be much higher, so you have to dry it in a different form than if you went in the desert and you were harvesting a dry plant. It starts out at a different moisture level. Sustainability is something that we're just really, in the last 3 to 4 years, in my opinion, starting to address in this industry and look at. I think there can be, and hopefully I will be able to be a part of that there should be a sustainability model for every species that we harvest. That's a big undertaking. Some of this work has been done just by the propagation techniques documented in the ornamental industry, but and some of the other members of this industry have written some small pamphlets. Years ago, I remember Alan Lockhart put out a pamphlet that talked about when to harvest and when to replant. But in my opinion, we have a long way to go in sustainability, knowing when to harvest the plant, not just when it's blooming and it's out there. We need to give it a chance to reseed. And a lot of this has been predicated in American ginseng. There's a harvest season for American ginseng, just like if you fish. If anybody fishes or hunts, you don't kill the babies. You don't harvest the 6 inchers. You throw those back and give them a chance to mature and propagate. You harvest the big mature plants who have had a chance to live out their lifespan. Same thing with a herbaceous plant or a species, even a tree species. We need to give that species, that plant, time to mature and give a chance for it to propagate and grow. Harvest the mature plants and let the small ones reseed. So I think we have a long way to go, but at least we're talking about it in a room this size with as many as you all are here, and we just need to keep talking about sustainability. Ask your suppliers, what are you doing about sustainability on this species? David talked about how many trees it takes to make a ton of cinnamon or a container load. That's amazing to me. Are we replanting back those? Are we regenerating from the roots? We just need to consider this every time we purchase a botanical. Create a wild collection plan. And to me, what that means is, for example, we worked on the Sioux Indian Reservation in Montana harvesting Echinacea angustifolia. It was a native species, and we were not allowed to go on the reservation, but we worked with the native population there to go out and harvest. So we told them we wanted to be sustainable about it, so we asked them to give us a map of the reservation, and we plotted out sectors of the reservation. And we said, okay, this year we're going to harvest this sector, next year this sector, next year this sector. And we also asked them to bring the seeds in from that. When they harvested it, we got the seeds, and we actually hired a helicopter to go back over that section, because that's where the seeds came from, and redistribute those seeds. Next year we did the same thing here and here, and I think we had it in a 4 to 6 year rotation. So to me, it'll vary with the species and where you are in your situation, but there needs to be a collection plan. Don't go back to the same area, the same population every year, or you'll just deplete it. Organic status, that's a whole other issue, and I believe April will probably talk a little bit about that. But we do organic handling at Herbal Ingenuity. We're also certified organic as a grower, and we also have some land certified organic for wildcrafting. So, general farm standards, I know, April, you'll talk a little bit more about this too. But anyway, just apply them to the crops that do not meet the definition of covered produce under 21 CFR 112. We're different than covered produce, okay? Typically is consumed raw, as it says here. We're not there. We're typically consumed as a dry product, and it can include wild harvest operations, so just remember those. Your buildings, your farm buildings, obviously they've got to be clean. I've been in a lot of different situations. They don't have to be laboratory clean, because we're still dealing with a raw agricultural product. But as soon as you get that product out of the ground and you start the steps you're going to take to clean it, whether you're going to wash it or not, whether you're going to just cut and sift it or just chop it up to eliminate the dirt from a root, each and every one of those steps, you've got to take another step to be cleaner in the next step. And one thing I tell a lot of my suppliers and growers, I said, just assume that product, you're going to pick it up and not only put it in your mouth at some point in time, you're going to put it up and put it in your child's mouth, your baby's mouth. They're more susceptible to this. You need to treat it like that. Don't go around and stomp on it. Don't let be exposed to the birds and the things flying over. So each step has to be a little cleaner than the next step. The location, the grounds, pest control. In our warehouse, we have a very extensive pest control program. You have to. It's a stored dry product. I mean, there's been papers and papers written on what insects love dried products, and they can come in. I've talked to a lot of people in the cereal industry that deal with a lot of the dried wheats and oats and barleys and grains, and it's amazing. You just got to have a really strong pest control program. The equipment, as it says, it needs to be suitable for purpose. Design and construction, and we'll see a lot of that in April, what they're doing at Trout Lake Farms. And you can't really go out and buy a Echinacea angustifolia harvester. For example, we had to look and see we modified a carrot harvester, because an angustifolia root is pretty much a taproot like a carrot. So we found a carrot harvester and modified it to harvest your Echinacea. You just have to implement and modify a lot of things. The cleanliness, toilets and hand washing facilities, you have to have those available from the field to your factory and from there on. The personnel must be trained. I can tell you this, that it's sort of like obtaining a new customer. It costs a lot to get them, but you need to keep them. The same thing with personnel and trainees working with you. You've invested a lot in training them how to harvest, how to handle, how to dry. It pays to retain your employees. I don't like to see a high turnaround in any industry, and especially in our business. We do all we can to retain some of our suppliers, some of our workers in the warehouse. When you have a new supplier or a new employee in the back to train them again, it's a costly issue. So do all you can to stick with them. There's always going to be issues. There's going to be problems, but it's much cheaper and much more advantageous to work those out, to retrain possibly. In records, we can't say enough about records. If the FDA comes in, if it's not written down, they don't care. It didn't happen. So just make sure you keep up with it. So anyway, the harvest aspect of the GACP covers both cultivated and wildcrafted plants. The conditions, again, it's important. Harvest crop conditions, the weather conditions, the timing. A quick example of that, the timing. We went out when in the late 90s when St. John's wort was really jumping to the top of the list for demands. And we were harvesting up in Washington and Oregon State, St. John's wort. And there's a certain stage of the harvest where you really get the high Hypericin levels. And I was curious why some of our material was really meeting the specs of the customers, the other was just borderline. So I went out and tagged the same plant. I went out and tied the exact same plant in the field. I harvested this section over here at 3 in the afternoon, 3 p.m. in the afternoon, pretty high sunshine. I took it in and we dried it in the same form. I went back out with my flashlight. I about got arrested. But I went back out in the field, harvested the other half of the plant, the exact same part of it, dried it in the same fashion. We sent them into the lab. The one I harvested at 3 in the afternoon, they said throw it away. The hypericin too low. The one at 3 a.m. in the morning, it was great. The only bad thing about that was we had to put lights on our harvester so we could get a harvest and get permission to harvest in the middle of the night. But that just proves the timing, just the timing of the day. That same day or night can make 12-hour difference, can make that much difference in some crops. Again, minimize foreign matter. You can't say enough about leave as much dirt in the field as you can as possible, or undesirable material. Weeding, and she's got some really good examples of that, how to keep the weeds down. And again, documentation. The harvester doesn't really think it's that important for harvest records, but that, along with voucher specimens and retention samples, we take voucher specimens of every species we get in. If it's a farming operation and they're using the same seed, we'll carry those over. If it's a new operation or wildcrafting, we try to get those to bring those in year after year. And then retention samples. I believe are required for 3 years. If I'm not mistaken, it's 3 years after the shelf life of the product. And we at Herbal Ingenuity, because we're a raw material supplier and we sell up the chain, we maintain all of our samples for at least 5 years just to make sure. Post-harvest handling techniques, there's a lot to say about that, and April will address a little bit of that also. Like it says, in certain cases, FDA considers some of these activities to be food processing activities subject to food GMP requirements. So make sure if you're at this level in the supply chain that what you're doing, if it falls under GMP, you better meet those GMPs. Again, post-harvest handling, immediately after the harvest, I spoke of that earlier. As soon as you can, get the product into some sort of, if you're extracting it, get into an extracting mode. If you're drying it, get it into the drying mode. Whatever you can do to stabilize it. Because you know as soon as you go pick a flower anywhere around in the yard, it's going to start drooping and drying down unless you get it to water or whatever. So, separation of the plant parts, the more you can do in the field, the better off you are. We've got a lot of equipment in-house that we can do separating, zigzag or air separation. We can do cutting. We got 3 or 4 different kind of sifters because that's a lot of what we do, separating the rocks from the roots, separating the leaves from the stems. But again, as much as you can do that in the field, the easier it is once you get it in-house. Again, washing and cleaning, make sure you use clean water and thoroughly wash it. Dehydration, I've already spoken a little bit about that, but the FDA regulations may apply to this process also. In some instances, they consider this a further step beyond the farm. It just depends on what you're doing to it. And the timing, the drying, the moisture content, you've got to know what the spec is for your customer or that product, either through a monograph or what your customer requires on the specs of the drying. A little bit of compliance with FDA, size reduction, extraction, packaging again, shipping, the transportation. We talked a little bit about that in a previous, that the FSMA is talking about the new regulations in transporting these herbs. And you've got to make sure you're not transporting them with a toxic chemical or even a food product. One thing we've done at Herbal Ingenuity, we've required all of our shippers to do not send us a refrigerated truck. Even though they say, well, it was the closest one we could bring in, the majority of the time a refrigerated truck is once upon a time hauled something frozen, maybe fish. We had a truck come in one time and the fish wasn't there, it was gone, but boy, could you smell it, and we rejected them because if it's been a refrigerated unit hauling something like that, many times it's been some leakage or spoilage possibility on the floor. So, okay. So traditional preparations, we're talking about these. I'm going to skip through the last few. Facility requirements. Obviously, guidance on food facility and farm mix type facility. We talked a little bit about that a couple of days ago, but you've got to figure out what type of facility you are. We're a farm mix type facility. We do some farming and some processing. So you need to know this and make sure you follow the proper 21 CFR 117s. The personnel, the plants and grounds need to be maintained, sanitation, obviously. Some of this goes without saying, in my opinion. I'm talking just last couple of slides about the AHPA assessment program. This is an assessment program that we vowed to put together when we first released the GACPs and appendices to that, to really show you, here's the GACPs, how do you take it out and put it apply it in your business, in the field, in the forest, or in your opportunity. So anyway, this is an assessment program that's free to you as members and everybody. We want everybody to use it off of the website. It's a roadmap and the documentation of which GACPs apply to you and how to use them in your operation. So here it is on the AHPA website. I know all of you visit the AHPA website. Just go under Resources, go under Good Agriculture and Collection Practices, and you can download. And this is just an example of the of the assessment tool. This one is specifically for cultivation. And I know it's hard to read up there, but it tells you about the propagation material. The best thing about this whole document, all of these forms have the NA section, the meet if your supplier or whatever you're auditing meets it, if it's a partial meeting or it's deficient. We've already applied this when we audit our suppliers, and even we've used it to audit ourselves in-house. We've gone out and said, hey, do we meet this? Or are we deficient in there? So in other words, everyone should be able to use this, and you can adapt it to your specific needs and to your program, make it fit for purpose. But this is a really good tool. It saved me a lot of work. We were in the process of developing some of these audit formats in this table, and this really helps out on these issues. And it's set up for cultivation, harvest, for post-harvest handling. Just take the opportunity to look at it. Again, go to the AHPA website under Resources, Good Agricultural Practices, download it and put it to use, and let us hear some feedback from you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ed, for this presentation. So now we're going to go to the second presentation by April Duffy. So April Duffy is a senior quality engineer at Amway Corporation, nutrition division of Nutrilite, based in Orange County in California. Within her 20 years in quality, April has developed the corporate good agricultural practices standard for Amway. She was the quality lead for Amway organic supplier qualification as well, and she was also a microbiologist for the Bush Houston Brewery. She's also a certified auditor with International Organic Inspector Association. So April is going to provide us some example at Amway of GACP implementation.
I think I'm gonna just use the mouse.
You should just be able to advance. I think yours is next year.
There we
you
go.
go.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, my name is April Duffy. This is my first time actually speaking at one of these things, so if I seem a little nervous, please forgive me, or God forbid I go catatonic, just come and give me a good slap. Or maybe not a slap, I'm not into that kind of stuff. But, so, I am with Amway, their Nutrilite division in Southern California. And today I would like to talk to you about how we implemented GACPs with our supply base as well as with our own Amway farms. So that beautiful picture there is one of our tractors in Trout Lake Farms. So, my roots are in supplier quality. So before I go into GACPs, I just want to give some oversight on supplier management and its connections to GAP standards. So, setting expectations early for new and existing suppliers it's critical to a supply management system. Regulations are constantly changing, markets are constantly changing, and you need to implement documents to specify what are your needs. If anything, the institution of marriage taught me, it is set expectations early to avoid the pains later. Confidentiality agreements, quality agreements, a thorough product spec, and also setting expectations with our supply base that transparency is something that we desire, and if you want to supply to Amway, you will have to maintain. So how do GACPs play into this? I mean, a lot of us are in manufacturing, and we feel confident in our heat treatment process, that we have alcohol extraction, we have strong GMPs in place. And we feel safe with those measures until you add one thing to the mix, and that is people. People have a tendency to challenge the system or lack thereof. Spills, people flow, illnesses, they think they're doing you a favor by skipping a couple steps because, you want to make a process go faster. They can really just gum up the works. So, and one thing I see frequently is that supply gaps are derived from quality issues are usually a perfect storm of errors. They aren't just one failure at a single control point. An example would be you have a supplier, there's a hurricane, and now they can no longer source for you this key ingredient. So you rush a qualification, you may skip a few steps because it's not lined out, and now you have GMO in a market that doesn't allow for it or requires a label and you don't have one. Micro-reducing steps are great at your facility, but you are sourcing from a farm that doesn't control their water quality post-harvest. So now you have material coming into your plant that is above the 5 log reduction that is allowed, and it's too high for you to sell in the markets that you're trying to sell to. Or other examples, your micro-reducing step is good enough, but for whatever reason, you are storing finished good with raw goods, or the Swaco screen post-heat treatment broke or is damaged, and the operator thought, you know what, let's just this one time use the Swaco screen pre-heat treatment. It's just a multiplicable effect. But the point is that this is why a risk assessment at subsequent points in various points in your process are necessary to avoid supply chain disruptions. So, I should use this little thingy. So now that we know we need to set expectations early, what are those expectations? And what do we specifically need? When you are assessing a supplier, you should utilize a cross-functional team to do so. This is not to say that they will immediately provide you with all the answers, but the point is that they will provide you with the right perspective. The individuals will ask the right questions at the right time and provide that necessary cross-functional collaboration. We all heard about Young Living was recently dealt a hefty fine for not having the proper permits in place for their wildcrafting source. So that's a heavy price to pay to miss that question. Hey, they're wildcrafting. Do we have permits that we need? And if they don't have the answer, then maybe we should look into that. So asking the right questions is critical when you're assessing your suppliers up front. In the 30 or 40 qualifications that I participated in, everyone has had its level of nuance or challenge that have stemmed from someone in the room asking the question, what's going on, or bringing up a point within collaboration that had we not considered that previously, it would really have been problematic for our supply base. So again, you think my perspective is quality. I may ask questions related to quality that, planning or procurement may not consider. So this is also, the goal of this document, of this guidance document, this assessment tool, to provide industry with guidance to ask the right questions of their suppliers and also of themselves. So it's a proactive approach to establish controls that will support quality of the products we sell and continuity of our supply base. So you want to make sure you get that cost and business review with your procurement. Are we capable of meeting forecasts and volumes with your inventory management? Are we meeting compliance in the markets that you are sourcing from, as well as the markets that you sell to? And R&D and quality, usually this person, they wear both hats, or it could be two individuals, but basically that capability assessment of the material, also of the facilities that you're sourcing from. One quick note I want to make about testing. We are comfortable using testing as a barometer for our supply base. More testing is not always the answer. Yes, testing does provide us and your customer and your regulatory agents verification that your process worked and was clean at the time that you produced that lot, which is great. I mean, now you're not going to give your customers diarrhea, but they actually expected that. So you don't get kudos for, giving them what they expected when they paid for it. What testing doesn't ensure is continuity. That the product will always be ready when I ask for it. You can test and test and test, and if it fails, now what? Where do I go? Now I don't have product to complete my work orders. So again, the point of this is really just to show, again, a risk assessment of various points within your supply chain will help assure that continuity. And asking the right questions and having this document will also provide you that additional support. So going into some of these, standards here. The rest of my presentation is really structured to align with the guidance document, mostly 3 through 17, sections 3 through 17. But, I'll also provide examples of what I look for as an auditor of our vertically integrated farms as well as our outsource. So, site cultivation. Is the cultivation site appropriate for the crop? We have 3 farms, one in Mexico, Brazil, and Washington State. And they all have very different types of soil, different types of climate, different types of water sources. And what grows well in Mexico may not grow well or provide the right assay levels or functional markers that we're looking for that can grow in Washington. So you want to ensure that the crop is appropriate for the site that it's grown. A thorough history, I think Ed went over a little bit of this, a thorough history of prior use of the cultivation site, is prepared and is maintained. Again, you don't want tribal knowledge. You want this written down because, if that farm manager leaves, then that information is lost. Does the farm management understand neighboring activities that may impact water downstream or upstream and impact the adjacent farms? Propagation, there's, of course, a source history of seed or propagation materials, roots, rhizomes, vegetative cuttings, and are they maintaining and verified for identity, for purity, and for cleanliness? And of course, you have to have lots and records for all of this information. When was it planted? When was it sowed? When did we purchase it? So all that traceability can be maintained. Fertilization. Are the fields healthy? Do they have a healthy soil condition? And the fertilizer application and handling is not a contamination to the harvested crop or water source. If chemical fertilizers are applied, that they comply with local and federal regulation. And does the operation understand its deficiencies so they don't end up over-applying or under-applying? If they're composting, you want to assure that it's fully composted material for food crop and they're not using things that are not allowed, such as biosolids or municipal waste, which we would not want for obvious reasons. So what do we look for? What's the audit trail here? We would want documentation of field maps that note buffer zones and physical barriers between neighboring fields, field history, input records, purchase records for the seeds, soil analysis, as well as a visual assessment. Again, with cultivation, you want your farms to have all irrigation identified, monitored, and maintained. So that includes all of their wells, if they're getting their water source from municipal or from the surface. You want to make sure water quality is maintained and documented, and that they're complying with local and state federal regulations. And they're also meeting adequate conservation practices to avoid runoffs and as a consideration. Crop protections and regulation. So, what is the farm's integrated pest management practices? Are they utilizing thresholds? Are they utilizing biological controls such as ladybugs, or cultural controls such as crop rotation or companion planting? And what are their weeding practices? Are they having to implement outside technologies to account for the labor costs to do hand weeding? So you want to ensure that that is also not a contamination to the field. If pesticides are applied, that again, those comply with local and state regulations, but it's also done by trained personnel, and they are given the proper protection when they are applying these crops. If the farm is organic, you want to ensure that they comply with CFR 205 and that they have their certifications that are up to date and accurate. Any disclosure of GMO seed, that's a big one right now. You want to make sure there are assurances and practices to conform to all relative federal and regional regulations. And you want to make sure you're working with operations that exhibit good environmental stewardship. That's the one thing you don't want to be associated with organizations that are damaging or degrading the communities that they're in or the people. So again, what is it we're looking for here? What's the audit trail? You want evidence and understanding of the laws and water requirements, well maintenance logs, water distribution systems mapped out, crop management plans, and any applicable certifications. I'm going to kind of skip wildcrafting. I think Ed did a really good job going into this. But the one thing, again, that I would look for is an audit trail here, permits, license, evidence of understanding, testing reports of the soil and the water of the cultivation sites. Do they have a wildcrafting harvest plan? And collectors' agreements and sanction policies. The collectors aren't adhering to the suppliers or the collectors, brokers' requirements, that they are sanctioned and proper corrections are taken. General farm standards. That the facilities and equipment are designed and maintained so not to contaminate product or product contact surfaces. You want equipment to be in working condition that are that's replaced in a timely manner if it becomes obsoleted. Storage, that storage is not a source of contamination for tools, for packaging materials, or anything that goes in the field, and that is kept clean and it is not a place of harborage for pests. Personnel, that they are provided proper training, specifically in regards to food safety practices, and that they are capable of recognizing contamination in the field and product that should not be harvested. You want enforcement of hand washing and communicable disease policies, and that they are provided with proper protective wear, potable water, and have adequate restrooms and break areas. I don't know if we remember a couple of years ago the listeria outbreak with, it was the cantaloupe, and the source that they found was, the crew didn't have proper restrooms in the fields. If I were working in a field and it was a half a mile to go relieve myself, I probably would pick a bush. And they're probably good enough to not do it in the field, but the issue is that the crews were going to the same area. So whatever contaminants that were on the ground, they ultimately would track in the field, and the crop would ultimately contaminate the harvesting equipment. So, that actually moved from the field into their processing areas. Again, that's a big one, that there's potable water and that they are adequately stocked, their restrooms. So what's the audit trail here? Applicable training policies, procedures, and records. We would interview some of the farm workers. We would do visual inspections, assessment of the facilities and equipment, documentation of equipment cleaning verification, and that scheduled and completed maintenance is done in a timely manner. Harvesting. I think, Ed, you kind of went into some of this as well, so we can kind of go through it pretty quickly. But, it's harvested under the right conditions. There are certain times where we, in our Mexico farm, delay some of our harvesting because if it's heavy rains, the microloads just get too high in order for us to process. So we want to make sure that that's done appropriately. The quality, that the harvested crop is maintained from field collection site through transportation to processing, and that appropriate measures are taken to minimize foreign matter, damage or degradation, exposure to exhaust, moisture, birds, rodents, etc. harvest is documented and samples are taken and that this is recorded and it's traceable. So any results that you get from those retains or those samples are traceable to the field and at the time it was harvested. Audit Trail here would be pre-harvest assessment, verifying minimal animal pest intrusion, flooding, and sources of potential pathogens. We would also look at harvest records that would identify yield quantities, policies and procedures for product handling and storage. Post-harvest handling. So, of course, yes, you want to make sure that it's immediately processed when it's pulled from the field and that it does not damage or impact the quality of the material. Of course, that we obtain the right plant part used. Washing, cleaning, and dehydration do not compromise the efficacy, the quality of the harvested crop, and considerations for timing, moisture, content are specified. So again, here, what are some of the things that we would look for? Crop harvest and storage records, crop storage inspections, pest control, and water quality for any water that is used on already harvested product. And lastly, I mean, this isn't really a separate guidance document, but record keeping is actually something that is addressed within each one of the sections. Accurate records should be prepared for each storage Accurate records should be prepared for each stage of site selection, planting, cultivation, harvesting, and post-harvest handling. Cleaning records are maintained as well, and equipment maintenance is documented. Product washing and cleaning performances are also evaluated and documented, so things like pH levels, or if there are certain solutions that they're using that the concentrations are of the right ppm, and that's captured. And the quality of botanical materials before and after cleaning. Records they have to be traceable, and they have to have identifiers such as applicable lot numbers, locations, dates, person involved, equipment used. You want strong documentation practices to provide evidence, to do more than just provide evidence that something actually happened. You want them to help facilitate trending and improve efficiencies, and also support root cause if necessary. So this picture right here really is, it's a picture of our DDS board, our daily direction setting board at our Brazil farm. And it just kind of shows some of the examples of trending that they utilize. They post this, it's a checklist, they discuss equipment maintenance that may need to happen, safety concerns that they have. It's really just a way to facilitate a dialogue with the crew, and also to communicate if there are challenges with equipment or the field, that they're able to get those addressed relatively early. Audit Trail here with record keeping, at the end of our audits we conduct what is called a traceability exercise, and basically what we're doing is we are taking a finished lot and we track it all the way through to the seed, and we ask multiple questions at each point. Are we able to identify when was fertilizer applied to this particular lot? What kind of irrigation did it receive? Were there pests invasive pests that they had to deal with? What were the lots that were used for this particular seed, or the transplants that were used? So at any point, if we get a non-answer, then we're able to support the farm and say, here is a gap, and let's focus in on trying to correct it. So, having said that, in closing, I just want to reiterate, I mean, most of us focus our time and attention on, GMPs and really maintaining and improving the quality of our manufacturing facilities. And agricultural practices may not be something that we're experts at. So, with this guidance document, we're really hoping that it will support our industry and support you with, asking the right questions, gaining the right perspectives, and, supporting your supply chain continuity and maybe a little bit of job security, so, which is something I like very much. Having said that, thank you for allowing me to speak, and that's it.
Thank you, Ed and April. So it was really informative. So we have time for question now. So if you...
Can I ask them?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'll ask you a question. How many of you ask your suppliers for the specificity, in other words, where the raw material came from? Is it some of that part of your protocol? Okay, that's good. I mean, do you get down to the, other than country of origin, do you ask for, if it's in the U.S., do you ask for state of origin or even region? Okay, that's going to help you a lot. I mean, that'll just tell you from the very beginning. First of all, Echinacea angustifolia doesn't grow in Louisiana. Sometimes you see that happen, or saw palmetto, you're not going to get saw palmetto from Missouri or Wisconsin. So that's going to be your first indication if something's out of its native range, if it's a wildcrafted item. Or even, like April said, these things have specific areas that they grow in. So it just didn't cultivate it. They're not going to cultivate saw palmetto in Canada. So anyway, those are the beginning questions. So your turn.
I actually ask if there are multiple farms that they collect it from in the same region or in the same country, particularly outside suppliers. So on that note, my question is, are these standards, and it may be a rhetorical question, are these standards also expected of foreign suppliers, foreign farms?
Yes. I mean, the simple question is yes. All of our, to me, that document was one of our next steps, foreign supplier verification program. You can adapt this document in those aspects for either a wild or cultivated. You definitely can use those for foreign suppliers. It's a really good first step towards FSMA in that indication.
Next question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So yes, a lot of the information that I went over recently, that is actually something that we require not just of our farms, but within our NutriCert program, those standards also apply. So, and those are all over the world. Again, we do understand that some of these may be aggressive for very, very small farmers. So we do understand that it could be a challenge, and it's something we have to work with them and develop them and issue corrective action, and just really explain why it's important. And for the most part, they've complied. So,
thank you. So, hypothetical question. Let's say there are multiple countries close enough within each other that have the same type of botanical or herb. What are your thoughts on collectively pooling all of that as one supply? You think there would be an issue with that? Same species, different country, maybe different soil, sorry? Mr. David? Oh, let's take it a step further. They all speak the same language, English. Just hypothetically speaking.
So are you saying that because they're in different locations, therefore
if they were to be pooled,
you would only audit one of them, and then that would account for the other?
No. I'm talking about the ingredient itself from the farm.
Okay.
It's pooled and sold as one source, one shipment, for example.
Okay.
Different farms.
They're pulling from multiple farms.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would that be an issue?
Well, no, not necessarily. If there's documentation that can have traceability to the farm, so I know what 3 lots or what 3 fields went into that one particular lot, and it's unique, then I can trace back to it. Also, are all 3 farms complying with good agricultural practices? If one is not, then it compromises the entire lot. So I then would want to know, are they all under the same management, or are they individual farms? And in some cases, we do have operations like this where we're not able to go to all of the farms, but we do set up a frequency such that if I audit this farm this year, then next year or my next recertification, I will audit the next one.
No, to David's point. David, right? Yes. What if the languages are different, but the crop is the same, but it's the same product? Like that.
Yeah. I'll give you a good example of that, and Michael knows exactly what I'm talking about. Golden seal, back in the mid-90s, there was some pressure. There always have been pressure on wildcrafted golden seal. So Michael was part of this. We went up to Wisconsin. He went up there and started talking to growers to see if we couldn't start cultivating golden seal. And it's a pretty high dollar crop. It's a pretty big investment, probably $12,000 to $14,000 for 1 acre to put up the shade, to put it under cloth, to get this planting stock, to get it going. And it's a 4 to 6 year crop. So that's a long time, a lot of weeding, a lot of work and everything. So my point is, one farmer's not going to plant the 10 acres that we needed. So we went up there, and Michael did too as part of this, talking to these different growers and said, okay, well, I'll grow 1 acre, I'll grow 2 acres, I'll grow 3 acres. And we were faced with the exact same issue, is each one of these, what's the end product going to be? Can we put them together? And we said, you have to all follow the same protocol. And so we got these guys together, and they actually formed the Wisconsin Golden Seal Growers Association. And we formed sitting around in a garage, in one of the gentleman's garage, on 5-gallon buckets. We all sat there and made the rules and regulations. And we're going to harvest it like this, we're going to wash it like this. And it formed a co-op. And then further to that, like Jeff was talking about earlier today, every one of them could not afford a washer. Every one of them could not afford the proper harvesting equipment. They couldn't afford the proper drying. So we pooled the resources. And when it was harvest time, we said, we're going to Bob's farm on Tuesday. We're going to Jim's farms on Wednesday. We're going to Kurt's farms on Friday. And then we'd move that equipment. So we knew that even though it was coming off different farms, the post-harvest handling was the same. Once it got out of the ground, we washed it in the same facility. We had 2 or 3 dryers. We dried at the same temperature. So in an aspect of that, we feel perfectly comfortable, and we're still working with those growers doing the same thing, that we can put all of that material in one lot and make a lot. So each situation is different. You're exactly right, though. You've got to look at the farming situation, not only the soil and how it's grown, but how it's harvested. Is it harvested similarly? Is it post-harvest handled similarly? So I would say every instance, but just because it's not grown in the immediate area, some of these farms are 3, 4, maybe 5, 10 miles apart. But there's a little variability, but it is the overall scheme of things that really makes a good homogeneous product. But again, we know what quantities come out of each, and they're individually sampled and tested prior to the lot conglomeration. So.
And again, just to, once the language is translated, would that be acceptable if the international farms are different, product the same, pooled, but the language is different? Would that be acceptable once there's an appropriate translation of
if
the
you have some
documents?
similar forms of continuity and say, follow these GACPs and audit them and make sure they are, I don't think it would be.
For us, if it's a different operation, it doesn't matter that the crop is the same, because we'll dual source. We still treat each farm as an individual source.
But with regard to the records, once you have the documentation translated in English, would that be acceptable?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question similar to my question to the last panel, but first I want to tell a little bit of that story that Edward and I, we independently ended up in Marathon County, Wisconsin. We both had this idea. I was in one business, he was in another business. We need golden seal. Well, geez, you would think that we got a multi-year understory crop, root crop, that needs to be grown under shade cloth. Sounds familiar. We both ended up talking to all these ginseng farmers. And as he said, over a period of time, we realized we wanted them all to have a similar approach in terms of the time they'd plant, the quantity they'd plant, the record-keeping requirements. And part of what we were willing to do was pay part of the planting costs by providing the material, and to guarantee a fixed price at the point of harvest. And then at some point, somebody said to me, well, are you paying as much as Edward Fletcher? And I was like, what do you mean, Edward? He's up here too. But I think the point of this is that when Edward and I found out that we were both trying to do the same thing, we decided that rather than try to knock each other off and compete, we had exactly the same interest. We got together, we said, what's your need? Okay, looks like we're going to produce this much. Can we come to an agreement as to how we're going to split the harvest? Now let's do this cooperatively. So I think it was a unique opportunity to not only find a way to work with the individual farmers and guarantee that their crop had a market, but also to remove for a moment the competition between the makers of this new project because it didn't serve either of our interests. I'm not sure that every speaker is going to be willing to say, well, sure, I'll share it with my competitor. I understand, especially if there's an insufficient supply. But let me get to my question, and again, it's similar to the one I asked last time, and I think we heard it some already on the grower side, which is we really want to offer this guidance as a tool that can be used by everybody in the supply chain, from the producer in the ground right up to that point of receipt by the manufacturer. We don't want to impose it on. We're not trying to force it on growers. We're trying to offer to them as a tool. These assessment tools are intended to show them that their compliance is only with the part that's relevant. But I still have concern, will the very smallest growers be able to comply if the demand from the marketplace is you must comply? And again, I think really what Amber said is, yeah, we can make that work, or April said is, we can make that work. We can make it work at the smallest farm. What about the smallest wild harvesters? Are we ever going to be able to get, especially in the U.S., where there's no organization generally of harvesters. It's individual entrepreneurial families or people that just go out in the woods. Are we ever going to be able to gain that same kind of participation in this record keeping that we're really starting to require of them? Are the local consolidators going to help us in getting those individual diggers and collectors to participate in this kind of record keeping? Love to hear from anyone.
I mean, I think a lot of it goes to partnering with the farmers. I think it was a great question on the last panel when they were talking about our distributors going to go away. And it's really about being transparent and being open and explaining to them, identifying the risk and explaining the risk to the farmer. And for the most part, the work that this is hard work. They got to fight changes in the environment. They got to fight invasive species that are coming. So, they don't want to lose their crop either. So understanding, how, equipment that you're putting in your field, or how personnel or how, animal intrusion could potentially impact the loss of your crop. They don't want that either. So for the most part, with the small farms that we've worked with, we identify criticals that, we want them to comply with. Maybe they don't, if it's a small family farm and it's just, husband and wife and their 2 sons, the training records, it may be not something that is such a point of contention, but we want them, if they're organic, that they have their organic plan. So, it's a work in progress. Similar to what my colleague had said before, it's progress, not perfection. But have we identified that this particular source is a risk to our supply base? And if it's not, then we can proceed. So
addressing wildcrafting specifically, as David Solomon said earlier, a lot of these places, other countries, they may bring a pound in, drop it on the table, get their $2, and they're gone. So that same has to be qualified. It'll never be the same as cultivated. It's just not as traceable. It's not as easy. There may be 300 people supply 100 pounds of product. It just may take that much. So we can keep pushing back, and we can ask for more information. And for example, as you know, Michael, wild ginseng, because it's listed on the CITES, they are required to have a documentation of what state they dug it in. They can't take it out of state. It has to be purchased in that state. They have to record, and most of them have to fill out their address, show their driver's license, and we're even asking, we talked about permitting a little bit earlier today, they're having to get a permit, so we know that they legally harvested it, at least following the permit. But as far as complete comparison to cultivation, that will be very difficult. But we are telling our consolidators and our suppliers that without this paperwork, we cannot buy from you. And, you know, when it hits their pocketbook, then they are going to stop and they're going to write it down as begrudgingly as they want to, that they bought it at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon and they bought this many pounds, and they're going to keep up with that. So when they get it all in the dryer and we have this one lot, we know at least it came from this range of days. So it will never be the same, but the more questions we ask and the more we train them and the more we're willing to say, unless you do this, we can't buy from you anymore, that's what changes the game.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Thank you.
I think my closing remarks are pretty much the same as my opening remarks, and that's to thank a lot of people. We could not have done this without the sponsors, NatureX in particular as our title sponsor, and all of the other sponsors that have been listed throughout the day and are listed on the side posters and listed in the back here. We just can't do it without the financial support. I really appreciate all of you. It's remarkable to me that almost everyone that was here this morning is still either here or in the other room. We mentioned in that other room, we're filming both of these events. So if you want to see the DNA discussion, which I heard was a little more exciting, it must have just been because it was a smaller room. I think that's it. But we will make that available to everyone that was registered here. I also would again thank all of the speakers. It's just been a really good program throughout the day, and all of you for being here and sticking around. And of course the AHPA staff, between us all, Natasha and Amber and Haley and Majid really organized all of this and made it all happen. So thank you all. We're going to do this again next year, probably still in association with Supply Side West, but we do sometimes think we ought to do this as a standalone event, and we'll be polling all of you. And actually, let me ask Amber, do you know, or do we have a survey for attendees? Are we asking for people to give us their opinions on how each of the speakers and sessions were? So Haley will send out, everyone that was registered will get an email to request your participation in a survey. It's really useful. It really helps us understand what you want to hear again and what we should retire and what we should add. But we look forward to seeing you again next year and working with you throughout the year in the meantime. Thanks again.